We on? Okay. Well, thank you. I'm glad. Thank you for being here and finding your way through the obstacle course this time. This is indeed the third lecture in this year's Clark Lectures, and this is number 3, Fame and Fragments. Remind you that the last lecture will come on Thursday, and we'll be holding back questions until the end of the lecture on Thursday. Among other things, to keep me from having to say repeatedly, well, I was going to get to that in the third lecture. Okay, my first subject today is the corpus of Sappho's surviving poetry as it was first presented in the newly durable form of print in early modern England. Early modern Europe, excuse me. To get there, I first need to work back to the beginning. We have 2 transcripts of Sappho's poetry dated with reasonable certainty to the 3rd century BC. One, its contents first published in 1937, is on a piece of pottery and has our main source for what is now designated Fragment 2. The other, providing previously unknown lines for Fragment 58, is on a papyrus whose discovery was announced in 2014, but is now entangled in controversy about its provenance. These are as close as we can get to Sappho's own lifetime, as far as written texts of her poems are concerned. Before and after that lifetime, Greek culture was being transformed by the use of an innovatively efficient alphabet to record things other than warehouse inventories. The momentousness of that change has occasioned much speculation and debate. The calendar of it is vague until we get to the 5th century BC. As for Sappho herself, it is probably safe to assume that her poems were composed with performance in mind, but there's no solid evidence as to whether she herself also wrote them down or had them written down, or if that didn't happen in her own lifetime, when exactly they were given over to the technological innovation that has made it possible for us to be puzzling over them now, some 26 centuries later. There are indications that Sappho expected, or hoped, or professed to hope, that future generations would be paying her some kind of serious attention because of her poetry. The survival of the most important of these, Fragment 55, is interestingly overdetermined. It is quoted by Plutarch in 2 different places, as well as by Stobaeus and Clement of Alexandria. That's the one at the top there. But when you die, you will lie there, and afterwards there will never be any recollection of you or any longing for you, since you have no share in the roses of Pieria. Unseen in the house of Hades, also flown from our midst, you will go to and fro among the shadowy corpses. The female addressee of that fragment is variously said to be a, quote, wealthy woman, Plusia, an uncultured, ignorant woman, Amusos, Amathes, an uneducated woman, Apaideltos. The 2nd century AD orator Aelius Aristides, while not quoting Sappho directly, seems to be remembering the rest of this poem or another poem on the same general topic when he links Sappho's satirical agenda to a soaring personal affirmation. I think you must have heard Sappho, too, boasting to some of those women reputed to be fortunate and saying that the muses had made her truly blessed and enviable, and that she would not be forgotten even when she was dead, unquote. Aristides, addressing a readership that had access to much more of Sappho's work than we do, makes it sound as if this boast was a commonplace part of her reputation. Next to these texts, 2 papyrus fragments look like even more acute expressions of the speaker's conviction that she will live through her poetry after her own death. In lines first printed in 2004, now designated Fragment 58b, we seem to catch a bolder version of the boast that Aristides reports. That's the second one up there, in its fragmented state. Now festivity gap, beneath the earth gap, having the honor as is fitting gap, as now upon the earth gap, sweet tone taking up the pactus gap, lyre I sing to the accompaniment of flutes, question mark. The musical references in the last 2 lines are confusing. Amending kalamois in the last time to kalamois, suggested by several scholars, would make attractive sense. I sing beautiful things for the muses. The point, in any case, appears to be that the speaker's performance on the current festive occasion, and participles identify the speaker as female, will be remembered when she herself is dead. The word that jumps out is geras, there in the, up there. Oh, in the third line of the fragment, geras. For which honor, which is the translation I've used here, honor is a rather pallid placeholder. The term is Homeric, denoting the kind of memorializing prize a warrior can hope to win through strength and valor. The even skimpier record of one of the Oxyrhynchus papyri associates Sappho more starkly with an even stronger Homeric term, and here is the next one. Sappho, I love you, or something like that, gap, cypress gap, queen gap, yet great cap, gap, all on whom shining gap, everywhere glory gap, and you in Acheron. Franco Ferrari has recently argued for sequencing this fragment with 60 and 86, yielding 30 lines of an appeal to Aphrodite with clear parallels to Poikilotheron to secure Sappho's posthumous fame for her skill in poetry. That is, Aphrodite, make me live after my death. The components remain separate in Neri's edition. There is no consensus here to bring these together in one poem. But it is commonly thought that the goddess of love is the speaker in at least this part of it. Kleos, there in the next to the last line, Kleos is the undying glory that the Homeric epics preserved for the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Fragment 65 adds one more entry, joining 120, 94.5, and 133.2 to the catalog of Sappho's deployment of her own name in her poetry, 4 times in what we have. Hesiod inserts his own name once into the Theogony, but doesn't make a habit of it. Alcman inserts his name into 3 of his surviving fragments, but in notably homely contexts, such as, Alcman made himself supper. When Sappho's name appears in her verse, more is at stake, as you can see in all of these, and I'll get some more later. Before the words just quoted, the second line of the papyrus consists of the tantalizing reading Rome, which normally would not be enough to entice the ingenuity of a modern editor, except that we meet the name Andromeda several times in Sappho's corpus. In fragment 131, she is said to have seduced Attis away from Sappho. Maximus of Tyre calls Andromeda one of Sappho's antitechnoi, professional rivals. Taken along with fragments 55 and 193, that name would fit. Sappho's claims to poetic immortality follow on her expressed scorn for women she considers her inferiors or enemies. As in Homer, Kleos is earned in combat. I'm touching here on a quality in Sappho that runs somewhat counter to the picture many people hold of her. My immediate impulse is to call it brassiness. It has sometimes been argued that Sappho's expectations of posthumous fame were related to the advent of writing, which gave her the confidence to voice them. She does indeed stand at the head of a long tradition of such affirmations by poets, especially lyric poets. Horace's odes are a self-conscious homage to the precedent she set. But Horace had Sappho's example to prove that such fame was possible. In her own time, she was, by comparison, shooting in the dark. Her confidence would have been steadied by the prospect of a written record, but wouldn't necessarily require it. And I appeal here to Hesiod's faith in the awesome power of word of mouth. No speech fame. No speech is ever lost once a lot of people talk it up. It too is some kind of God. That sounds startlingly like what we now call going viral. If people start talking something and repeating it, it's like a god and you can't stop it. The old-fashioned term is, of course, rumor, which lent itself in its day to some vivid personifications. It is something which technological advances, writing, printing, the internet, can amplify, apparently without limit. But in itself, it is, I suspect, an inherent potential in human communication, and Sappho herself would seem to have felt and used its power. History for a while obliged, but had trouble making up its mind. With the spread of alphabetic literacy in the Greek world, Sappho's poems did become famous. A Hydria from 5th century BC shows a figure labeled Sappho reading from what may be an early edition of her own work, though making out the partially visible text is a challenge. By the early 2nd century, her poems had been collected and circulated in comprehensive editions. The poems were presented in 8 or more likely 9 books, organized partly by meter and partly by genre. Fragment 30 comes with an annotation giving a strophe count of 330, meaning 1,320 lines organized into 4-line strophes for Book 1, which is of which this is apparently the last poem. If the other books were on this scale, the total corpus would have had roughly the heft of the Odyssey. It is from this assemblage that later classical writers would be quoting. In 129 AD, the allure of Sappho's exotic dialect moved one Julia Balbila, a Macedonian aristocrat in the court of the Emperor Hadrian, to compose 3 poems in a labored recreation of Sappho's long obsolete Greek, and have them inscribed on a monumental statue in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Not the one that is thought to have inspired Shelley's Ozymandias, but nearby. The correspondence of the apostate Emperor Julian in the 4th century shows him fond of phrases from Sappho's poems. A scrap of parchment containing what is now fragment 4 and part of fragment 3 is datable to the 7th century and testifies to the continuing availability of Sappho's text at least that late, though it is also the last such testimony we currently have. 4 centuries later, the Byzantine scholar Ioannis Tsetses, explaining why he needed to use examples from Pindar to discuss Greek prosody, declares offhandedly, as if it were no longer news, that, quote, the passage of time has destroyed Sappho and her works. The church has been suspected of having something to do with this, presumably because of her love poems. The 2nd century theologian Tatian did call her a whorish, sex-crazed female. Elusive rumors have been generated of a public burning of her works, but there is no evidence to substantiate them. Almost all the other Greek melic poets, of whom only Anacreon was really lascivious enough to warrant such attention, suffered the same fate and, in fact, disappeared from the record much earlier than Sappho. But those substantial Alexandrian editions did eventually disappear, as far as we know, never copied into any other form, leaving behind a still radiant but very spotty memory. Shortly before Tsetses' time, the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena, writing the epic biography of her father, the emperor, quoted from fragment 137, Me koloe aidos, shame prevents me, to justify not getting more deeply into the heresies of the Bogomils, and identified the phrase as something the beautiful Sappho said somewhere, or in Greek, poo. That shy enclitic is honesty on her part. She would indeed not have known exactly where Sappho said this, any more than we do. Komnena is slightly misremembering Aristotle's Rhetoric, where the phrase is quoted but not actually attributed to Sappho. It is said to be from a poem by Alcaeus, to which Sappho replies in lines Aristotle also quotes. Komnena would have been justified in thinking Sappho actually composed both sides of this interesting he said, she said exchange herself. An ancient scholiast and numerous contemporary scholars have thought as much. But she was dealing with Sappho at the kind of remove at which all readers of Sappho have had to stand for almost a millennium, entirely reliant on a reputation, the beautiful Sappho, a phrase that comes up repeatedly in his Testimonia, in combination with whatever quotations happen to have been made by others back when the Alexandrian texts were still around. As luck would have it, though, Komnena is specifically anticipating Sappho's debut in the far less vulnerable medium of print. In 1443 to 1445, George of Trebizond produces a Latin translation of Aristotle's Rhetoric, and circa 1475, Petrus Caesarus Wagner and Johannes Stoll print it at the University of Paris. As the other classical writers who quoted Sappho began to appear in print, so, of course, does Sappho. In the 1495 Aldine Press edition of the treatise on syntax by Apollonius Discalus, the Apollonian grouch, from the 2nd century AD, he was a grammarian, of course, presents Sappho for the first time in Greek type when the grammarian quotes fragment 33. It's the golden crowned Aphrodite. If only I could win this throw of the dice. The grouch's interest, by the way, was restricted to Aithe, the first word there. He wasn't interested in the rest of the quotation. Further piecemeal publications of this sort follow, both in Greek and Latin. They've recently been cataloged by Anagriva up to 1557. The count there is 23 published books containing 45 different Sapphic quotations. Most instances are too brief and incidental to attract any lingering attention, but in Venice in 1508, Aldus Manutius publishes 2 works by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, one of which contains a single line from an Epithalamion, 133, and the complete text of Poikilothron, the magnificent gateway poem of the Alexandrian edition. As a gateway, it was in sorry shape. P.J. Finglass has had a close look at the text as Demetrius Ducas prepared it for this edition, and is being gentle when he says, quote, "Much is beyond comprehension, and overall it is hard to see what the poem is about," unquote. Finglass valiantly attempts an English translation to show what he means, but in places he just has to throw up his hands. And there, the next one there, one in the middle of it, that is this original appearance of the first stanza of the Poikilothron. And here is Finglass's, impressively straightforward translation. "And what I want to happen most of all for my heart, what when I am to persuade they caught friendship with a dragnet some what?" You look there, psaphadike is the word there in the fourth. Psaphadike is a fascinating formation. It might make a good name for a lesbian superhero, but in addition to not fitting the meter, it's not a word in any version of classical Greek. It's the debris of a scribal or compositorial train wreck of what used to be and will in time again be one of the poem's unforgettable moments. "Tis so sapphadike, who, Sappho, does you this injustice?" Our real takeaway here, however, should not be the mockery, but a proper humility at how much the first generations of humanists had to work through to achieve even minimal understanding of what was in front of them. An edition of Dionysius' work published in Paris in 1547, edited by Robert Etienne, better known as Stephanus, fusses with the text of the Sappho poem, but still can't quite make sense of it. Here's the next one here. This is Robert Etienne, and Finglass again, giving his best. "And what I want to happen most of all for my frenzied heart, whom when I am to learn to catch you with a dragnet justice of friendship, Sappho." The stanza still gives editors problems, though they eventually did manage to get the metaphor from commercial fishing out of there. Progress comes, however, in another quarter, when in 1554, an edition of that classical Greek essay on the literary sublime, which had already had significant manuscript circulation in humanist circles, is printed in Basel, in Switzerland, putting fine timoi before the reading public in a reasonably legible text. The fine timoi is the one I talked about last time. The 2 more or less complete poems that are the cornerstone of Sappho's modern reputation as a poet were now out there and set to endure. In the same year, Robert Etienne's son, Henri, began another project. He had come upon the manuscript of what we now call the Anacreontia, anonymous and not very demanding late classical poems on drinking, sex, and the good life, which Etienne mistook for poems by the Melic poet Anacreon, a near contemporary and in popular fantasy sometime lover of Sappho. These, the younger Etienne copied out and back in Paris, published with an extravagant preface celebrating Anacreon's return from the dead. As a kind of afterthought, Etienne added texts of Sappho's Poikilothron and fragment 168b, a modest but public and, as it turned out, effective beginning to the enterprise of regathering what history had scattered. To the second edition of his Anacreonta in 1556, he added fragment 31. That's the finest timeline. And then in 1560 issued his Carminum Poetarem Novem Lyricae Poeseos Principum Fragmenta, a diminutive, really tiny, but thick and surprisingly inclusive edition of what he could bring together of the Greek Melic poets. Pindar, of course, but also, and listed on the title page, you can see there, Alcaeus, Anacreon, Sappho, Bacchylides, Stesichorus, Simonides, Ibycus, and Alcman, non nulla etiam aliorum, also a few others, including Archilochus. The main presentation of Sappho occupies 39 pages, beginning with Egidio Gregorio Giraldi's 16th century Latin Life of Sappho, followed by the Greek text of 44 fragments, including in many cases surrounding text of the work from which the quotation is taken, with Latin translations of the Greek on the facing page. 6 more were added toward the end of the volume, though without Latin translation. 3 of Etienne's fragments, including 2 poems attributed to Sappho in the Planudian anthology, are no longer considered hers, and there are 4 cases where scholars have been able to combine fragments previously kept separate. So the count by current editorial standards is 43. A second edition in 1566 includes a further supplement providing, also without Latin translations, a dozen new fragments, including the text of Maximus of Tyre's comparison of Sappho's circle to that of Socrates, and adds at the end the Latin text of the Ovidian letter of Sappho to Phaon. In this form, the collection is reprinted numerous times at various locations. Ben Jonson is known to have owned a copy of a 1598 printing. This is the context in which a Renaissance reader is most likely to have encountered Sappho as something other than just a mythic figure, rather as an ardent and articulate speaker, summoning Aphrodite's provocative and intelligible, and by now only slightly misspelled question, tis o sapphoi adicee, or on the right-hand page, Latin, translation Latin page, quis laecesit te, mea Sappho, who harms you, my Sappho? Or who harms you, my Sappho? Another gathering is published by the Plantin Press in Antwerp in 1568. Edited by Fulvio Orsini, or Ursinus, the illegitimate but acknowledged descendant of a noble Italian family, librarian at the Palazzo Farnese in Rome for the second half of the 16th century. The volume is dedicated to Orsini's imposing patron, the Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. Orsini's general rubric is here not just classical Greek lyric, but also elegy and pastoral, with, intriguingly, Etienne's canon of 9 lyric poets displaced at the start of the volume by a grouping of 9 women poets, announced on the title page. Carmina novem illustrium feminarum Sapphus, Myrtidis, Praxilai, Erinai, Corenae, Nocidis, Myrus, Telesilae, Anitae. They end up providing a comparatively brief introduction to a substantial volume. The presentation shifts over to male poets after 75 pages of a 400-page book. Orsini does not go into detail about the rationale for heading his collection this way. It may simply be advertising at the expense of his immediate predecessor, since of Orsini's 9 women, only Sappho and Erinna appear in Etienne's volume. Though Orsini may also be responding to a particular interest in women's poetry felt elsewhere in Cinquecento literary circles. Lodovico Domenichi's groundbreaking anthology of contemporary women's poetry in Italian, Rime diverse d'alcuni nobilissime e virtuosissime donne, including poems by Vittoria Colonna, Veronica Gambara, Gaspara Stampa, among others, had been published at Lucca in 1559. Orsini's expansion of the female classical canon is less than dramatic. Telesilla, for example, is represented by exactly 1 line of verse. and Sappho remains by far the most important representative. The presentation of Sappho, however, does add to what Etienne offers. There are 59 fragments printed in freestanding form, unencumbered with the context from which they are taken. 13 of these are not given by Etienne. Another 15 quotations, some to be sure involving a single word, are embedded in a selection of testimonia, 9 of these not in Etienne. 2 items in Etienne are not to be found in Orsini, one of them no longer attributed to Sappho. The lyric texts do not come with Latin translations, though at the end of the volume, Lorenzo Gambara's Latin verse translations of the pastorals of Bayan and Moschus are provided. At the opening of the Sappho section, which runs for 30 pages, 5 one-line fragments of hers summoning inspiration for her song from the Muses or the Graces, or in one case from her lyre, are printed one after the other as a kind of fanfare to open the volume. At the end is the text of the ubiquitous Ovidian letter of Sappho to Phaon, offering a biographical context more confidently fictional than Giraldi's. Which brings me to my second subject for today. How does Sappho's collective oeuvre come across in the form it assumes in these 2 editions in the 16th century? Joan Dejean, who has given Etienne's edition the closest attention it has received so far, also details the significant difficulties anyone would have had extracting some inclusive sense of Sappho from the way the material is presented there. It's not an easy volume to work with. One thing, because you don't just look and see the quotations of Sappho, you see a lot of prose there, and sometimes the quotations are embedded in the prose, and you have to work at it. Orsini's format, which just gives the quotations, but is more user-friendly, but only for someone whose Greek is already pretty good, because there are no Latin translations. I confess that I have, so far, little, if any, information as to what actual 16th century readers saw when they looked at either of these editions. What I offer is largely my own considered response, and I realize there is something artificial about the exercise. I think it is worth setting out because generally scholars and critics have hurried past this point to assimilate later developments. Except as noted, I will not be citing Sapphic fragments discovered since the Etienne and Orsini editions. But I will be keeping them in mind, and at a certain point, I will drop that limitation. Within these ground rules, my agenda is to resist biographical distractions as much as possible. Phaon has left the building, while also getting beyond the tendency for poikilothron and phainetaimoi to dominate the discussion. Those 2 poems deserve the attention they have received, but they made it into the 16th century surrounded by a sporadically revealed hinterland, parts of poems offering glimpses of the wider terrain that gave the famous poems birth and nourishment. What do these fragments have collectively to tell us? Taking them in this way asks for an imaginative but disciplined approach, probably beyond systematizing, for which there aren't many ready models in professional literary criticism. We are helped by the fact that some of the fragments, though they unquestionably are fragments, have a searing force that doesn't really leave us needing what's no longer there. And there at the top, love shook my heart like a wind falling on oaks on a mountain. Okay? Winds like that come out of nowhere and can't be reasoned with, and the oaks just have to go with it. A millennium later, Nonnus of Panopolis, classical antiquity's last epic poet, will exploit a close cousin of Sappho's verb, titino, as one of the key drivers of Dionysiac madness. In the words of my fellow Texan, Lyle Lovett, you can't resist it when it happens to you. And I venture that the reason it does not need an antecedent, and it doesn't, right, has to do with the tradition of love poetry of which Sappho is our earliest recorded exemplar. She is for European poetry the originary poet of unaccountable and overwhelming desire beyond predicting or explaining or contesting. The Ovid of the Amores and the Ars Amatoria, a silver-tongued devil who had, at least by his own account, cut quite a swath through the dainty dames of Rome, as Ovid's Elizabethan translator Arthur Golding will call them, and whose poetry history has treated much more gently than it did Sappho's, is, by comparison, a charming but badly spoiled opportunist. Ovid, however, offers not just a point of contrast. His way of making his own poetic ambition part of what he writes about spans his entire career. Some fumbling negotiations with the god of love at the start of the Amores concern not the dainty dames of Rome, but the poet's choice of meter and genre. After he gets straight on that, the grand arc of achievement reaches to the end of the Metamorphoses, where he confidently announces, quote, "My work is done, which neither the wrath of Jove, nor fire, nor sword, nor the gnawing tooth of time shall ever be able to undo," unquote. Astonishingly, he actually manages to understate his professional success. Quote, "Wherever Rome's power extends over the conquered world, I shall have mention on men's lips," unquote. Along the way, he has numerous times, like Sappho, introduced his own name into his text. Not with great solemnity, to be sure, but that's how it is if your cognomen is the Latin word for nose. In his exile poems, his supposedly chastened admission that it was the ars amatoria that brought about his downfall turns into a lugubrious boast. Ingenio perii naso poeta meo. I, the poet Naso, died of my own talent. I wouldn't imagine that the damage to Sappho's oeuvre conceals anything so systematic, but the authorial self-references in what we have of hers set her off from the other Melic poets. Orsini was onto something when he extracted those 5 invocations and used them to introduce her fragments. They're not just garnish, but signals of the poet's own aspirations as a poet, aspirations that then become part of the poem itself. That move, in turn, becomes part of her legacy. For Horace, quite specifically, and Ovid more generally, though neither of those poets combine it with an eroticism that has the disruptive intensity of Sappho's. The fragments we have never quite show Sappho bragging about her standing as a poet. The closest we come is a slightly coy remark that Demetrius quotes as an example of praise that relies on charis, charm, rather than megathos, grandeur. And that's the second quotation up there. Superior as the lesbian singer to those of other lands. The unidentified person being praised here is male, and for some kind of excellence. Periojos, Aeolic, which is Aeolic for periojos, signals a brand of competitiveness that marks a wide range of classical Greek culture, as in the heroic code of the Homeric warrior. Always to be best and stand out above others. The original context would presumably have told us exactly what this guy was so good at. Whatever it was, Sappho demurely cloaks any counter-affirmation of her own excellence within the collectivity of all lesbian poets, while also deferentially employing the same masculine form of the adjective, lesbios. Still, for this excellent man to accept the praise he's been offered would be for him to acknowledge that, as everybody knows, lesbian poets are the best there is. According to the Suda, a Byzantine encyclopedia of Greek culture, meta lesbion oidon, after the lesbian singer, was proverbial for in second place. The implication that there was already in Sappho's lifetime some kind of interregional professional network of lyric poets, with at least informal rankings, the disposition later institutionalized in the Pythian Games, is worth logging. Poetry is a contest, she is reminding this admirable man, and yours truly is on the world championship team. In a couple of other instances, the writers who have preserved lines of Sappho's give them even more bite. When Athenaeus, in his compendium of learned dinner conversation, quotes a florid come on from one of her poems, and this is the next one there. Stand before me if you love me, and spread abroad the grace that is on your eyes. She also informs us that its addressee is, quote, a man who is extravagantly admired, and 2 very fancy Greek words there to indicate that, for his figure and considered handsome, unquote. The whole poem in this case is likely satirical, perhaps with a gendered edge, mockery of a parodically male outsider to entertain the coterie. But Maximus, in his comparison of Sappho's circle to that of Socrates, highlights, indeed seems to celebrate, the needling she also gives to those closer in. And I'll get here in a minute to the next quotation here. But I'm start off quoting Maximus of Tyre. Sometimes she censors Gorgo and Andromeda. At other times, she cross-examines them and uses irony, just like Socrates. For Socrates says, "Good day to you, Ion," and Sappho says, I wish the child of Polyanax a very good day. Good day to you, Ion, is the opening of Plato's Ion, in which Socrates goes on, as usual, to out-argue his hapless young interlocutor. Maximus doesn't spell it out, but his point seems to be that in its original context, Sappho's line vibrated with the same more or less affectionate condescension that sophisticated readers had come to feel in Socrates' now proverbial incipit. Good day to you, Ion. Good day to you, Ion. Let's see who's going to win this time. In the versified exchange with Alcaeus in Aristotle's Rhetoric, with which Sappho broke into print, that assignment of speakers has been doubted, but I'll stay with it. The male speaker's hesitant opening, I wish to say something to you, but shame prevents me. This is where that quotation that Comnito made earlier. The male speaker says, I wish to say something, but shame forbids me, is abruptly cut off. And then the quotation there at the bottom of the page is what the woman says in reply. If you had I lost a page. Oh, no, that's not true. Oh, okay. No, I didn't. The text, especially in the last line there, eleges perito dikaio, is problematic for metrical and other reasons, but both Etienne and Orsini seem unbothered by it, and the sense is reasonably clear. Quote, okay, this is the translation, okay, for that passage, which is the reply to shame forbids me. If you had a desire for what is honorable or good, and your tongue were not stirring up something evil to say, shame would not cover your eyes, but you would state your just claim, unquote. Is it only an accident of transmission, it would be an eloquent one, that the man seems to have been interrupted 2 syllables into his second line before he can even get to the point? He's not refuted, but he has the tables so swiftly turned on him that there isn't really much he could say. If I were he, I'd shut up at this point. Through these fragments, in other words, we can pick out a run of deftly calibrated punchlines, lovingly preserved exercises of the skill of sizing people up and putting them in their place. This is, as it were, part of the weather within which Sappho sings of love. It would, I think, be a mistake to segregate it into a separate category such as satire. Desire itself is not off limits to the skill in question. One fragment, transcribed for us by Hephaestion, a 2nd century AD connoisseur of classical Greek meter, when he needed an example of a catalectic tetrameter, is a cool assessment of the attractiveness of 2 women. Nasidica, more shapely than tender Girino. Etienne prints this one freestanding. Orsini splices it together with a dismissive take on another woman from the same source to make a couplet that ends, having never found anyone more annoying than you, Irana. Another line preserved by Hephaestion appears to celebrate the egregious Andromeda's getting some well-deserved comeuppance. Andromeda has a fine recompense. And in what may or may not be the same connection, Athenaeus identifies her as the target of some slightly but not fatally garbled mockery of her taste in other women. And then they're on just past the middle of the screen. And what country girl beguiles your mind, dressed in country garb, not knowing how to pull her rags up over her ankles? Choice of clothing and knowing how to wear it count for a lot in these matters. Andromeda is not the only one of these women whose name appears more than once in the Sapphic fragments. Irana turns up in fragment 135. Nasidika is likely the Dika in fragment 81, who is set straight on the importance of properly garlanding oneself with flowers. Girino has turned up in 2 of the Oxyrhynchus papyri. I will be coming to Anactoria, Attis, and Gongola. Whatever their biographical reality, they probably had at least some, these women are ongoing characters in Sappho's poetry, which they populate in ways that inflect even the poems in which they do not appear. Attempts to be specific about the network of which they are part, to sort out factions or schools or trace particular love affairs don't and can't get very far. But a subtext of collective attentiveness, heightened by desire, runs through almost everything. It radiates off a run of lovingly sighted objects, innumerable drinking cups. Indeed, at the wedding of Hector and Andromache, innumerable drinking cups made of silver, ivory, gold, linen clothing soft to the touch, expensive perfumed handcloths sent as a gift to Aphrodite, a purple mantle, Sappho reportedly the first to use the word chalamus, mantle, worthy of her son Eros, an egg the color of hyacinths, golden chickpeas growing on a bank, golden sandals worn by dawn, some unspecified object more golden than gold, an artfully dyed sandal on a foot that we don't quite get to see. A colorful leather strap hid the feet, a fine piece of Lydian work. Did I put that up there? Yeah, there it is. The Amumena erga, flawless handiwork of the women of Lesbos, is proverbial in Homer. The erotics of their footwear animate a famous poem by Anacreon, where, echoing Sappho's language, the poet longs for a young lesbian woman who is pokilosambalos, wearing intricately wrought sandals, but whose interest lies elsewhere. Athenaeus attributes to Sappho something like a personal philosophy behind the elegance, and this is the final quotation up there. Ego de philem abrosunan, which Diane Rayor deftly Englishes as, I love the finer things. Abros is one of Sappho's favorite adjectives. Critics have sometimes had trouble taking the implied lifestyle all that seriously. Dennis Page, one of Sappho's most distinguished modern scholars, calls it girlish and can be brusquely condescending to the sorts of things that go on in it. On fragment 96 from a 6th century AD parchment, quote, what is revealed we observe to be devoid of anything profound in thought or emotion or memorable in language. The occasion is commonplace enough. One girl has gone away, leaving a broken heart behind. That is nothing new, unquote. It may be the aura of promiscuity hovering about these poems that tempts them to trivialize them. The history of multiple love objects that Aphrodite implies in her speech to Sappho in Poikilothron is cited by Page as evidence that the whole conversation is relatively lighthearted, conducted in a spirit of good-humored raillery, the goddess of love, quote, a little impatient but tolerant as a mother with a troublesome child, unquote. With Sappho, quote, laughing at herself even in the moment of her suffering, unquote. All in all, quote, this everlasting sequence of pursuit, triumph, and ennui is not to be taken so very seriously. Against this trivialization of the principal arena of Sappho's poetry, I would set the abruptly authoritative, indeed authoritarian verb in Aphrodite's question, to which I keep returning. Tis o Sapph adikee, who, O Sappho, does you this injustice? The verb may not really register on many readers, even quite attentive ones. Bruno Schnell, in The Discovery of the Mind, 1948, makes strong claims for Sappho's importance in European cultural history, but tosses off the throwaway remark that, quote, Sappho and Alcaeus do not think about justice at all, unquote. It is certainly not among the usual topics of lyric poetry, though it apparently comes up at the end of Sappho's purported exchange with Alcaeus, quoted later. Anne Carson, in a sharply observed article in 1980 that preceded her Eros the Bittersweet, emphasizes the import of adikee in connection with her close reading of the following passage in the Greek. And Sappho, quoting Carson now, is not daydreaming about imaginary reversals, being loved by the woman who currently rejects her, but looking forward to concrete and inevitable revenge, unquote, when the object of her present love will suffer the same despairing torments that she herself is now undergoing. The poem, Carson thinks, is confident that time itself will bring this about as the attractive younger woman ages and becomes the older woman in the same scenario. That's when I'll discover that revenge is sweet, when I sit there applauding from a front row seat. One might well quibble that revenge and justice are two different things. Later ethical and legal thought works hard at drawing the line between them. One should do more than quibble at any implication that not reciprocating someone else's desire is some kind of punishable crime. Loving someone, however passionately, cannot in any way legally or morally obligate that other person to respond in kind. That has to be clear if you sit down and think about it. Carson indeed argues that by having Aphrodite not pause for an answer to her specific question, who, Sappho herself discreetly elides the goal of specific vindictiveness. Still, heaven knows, the sense of entitlement dies hard. Since that I so kindly am served, I fain would know what she hath deserved. And Sappho's poem has me thinking of a passage in Doris Lessing's memoirs, where she looks back on the experience of stealing the man who became her first husband away from his fiancée. Quoting Lessing, I was not in love with him, though such were the intoxications of the time, it was easy to think so. He was not in love with me. In fact, he was engaged to a girl in Britain where he had gone on leave a year before. I could excuse myself by saying he was 10 years older than me and did not mention the girl until it was too late. But that is not the point, which is my calm ruthlessness as I took her place. This is a basic female ruthlessness, female unregenerate, and it comes from a much older time than Christianity or any other softener of savage moralities. It is my right. When I've seen this creature emerge in myself or in other women, I have felt awe. Unquote. Those who have found Lessing at times an unnerving figure may take comfort in the fact that she sometimes felt that way too. I am not, to be clear, arguing for any kind of primordial female menace in Sappho's poetry or anywhere else. The reason Snell doesn't think of her in connection with justice is precisely the absence in her surviving fragments of the retaliatory code openly voiced in the poetry of Archilochus, say, whose own disappointment in love Snell thinks is specifically relevant here. And I'm quoting a famous line by Archilochus, one important thing I know is how to repay with interest the evil which others have done me. More overtly, in a poem by Theognis, a would-be lover charges the young boy refusing his advances with perpetrating an injustice. O pai, me madike. O child, don't do me this injustice. With a turn into mythology, threatens him with the fate of Atalanta, who in fleeing, quote, the golden gift of Aphrodite, unquote, comes in the end to receive it in spite of her refusal. Something very close to a threat, or as the speaker might say it, heartfelt promise of rape. Sappho's poem hints at such a threat in a strategically placed line that, as it happens, also specifies the gender of the beloved, kuk eteloisa, even if unwilling, there in, that's just from the Poikilothron. Even if, she will love even if unwilling. A now widely accepted reading that took a while to recover gestures toward it. But the poem itself, I agree with Carson here, also deflects the threat. Deflection that, if anything, heightens the bravery of Adikee and the ungirlish awe it deserves to inspire. The unattainable desire is indeed the speaker's right, a speaker who, as it happens, goes out of her way to identify herself as Sappho. Being affirmed here in the poem, if nowhere else, indeed possibly because there is nowhere else. Hephaestion, at one point, runs together what may be two separate two-line fragments in the same meter. They've acquired two different numbers, 130 and 131, and in modern editions are usually kept apart, but Etienne and Orsini both present them without comment as sequential lines in the same poem to interesting effect. Once again, limb-loosening love makes me tremble, the bittersweet, irresistible creature. Atthis, the thought of me has grown hateful to you, and you fly off to Andromeda. The three-word second line, glycupikron is the first word, glycupikron amachenon orpeton, is one of Sappho's most famous. As far as we can tell, glycupikron bittersweet, or sweet bitter, as some translators now want to have it, is her coinage, an oxymoron of flavors, which, as it happens, turns up in Petrarch, Canzoniere 164. In Sappho's first line, deute, once again, is another newly created word, de plus aute, de meaning now, aute meaning again. We have no idea if Sappho invented this one, too. Carson draws attention to it as a particular favorite with love poets, especially Anacreon. It tolls 3 times in stanzas 4 through 5 of Poikilothron, in Sappho's own voice and then in Aphrodite's, to signal the endless repeatability of it all. Who is it this time? The 2 lines stand together with fragment 47 here to affirm Sappho's vulnerability to desire in its most imperious, intense, and disruptive form. They could serve as a personal motto for her as a love poet. Lines 3 and 4 juxtapose this inclusive, abstract statement with one of the most specific indications in the corpus of a narrative behind all this. Attis, for whom Sappho elsewhere openly declares her love, has now not only left her, but has done so for a woman whom Sappho elsewhere derides. The exact chronology of this is unknown. Sappho's scorn for Andromeda may or may not have preceded Attis's departure. But if we accept the juxtaposition of the 2 fragments, the speaker's unforgettable epiphany of the overwhelming power of Eros comes not at the beginning of the love affair, but at the end. In my final lecture, I will argue for the truth of that in what I think are 3 of Sappho's best points.